Robert Thompson's morning ritual of coffee on his back porch was legendary among his neighbors. At 68, the retired electrical engineer had the energy of someone half his age and the stubbornness of someone twice it. His corner lot home, a charming craftsman with a wraparound porch, sat at the edge of Sunny Pine subdivision, where it bordered an undeveloped woodland that provided the sanctuary he'd sought after 4 decades with Houston's power company. "Morning, old friend," Robert whispered to the 100-year-old oak that marked his property line, its massive branches stretching protectively over his award-winning heirloom tomatoes. His garden wasn't just a hobby, it was his legacy, with seedlings descended from his grandfather's Depression-era Victory Garden. The harsh mechanical grind of the mail truck interrupted his reverie. Shuffling down his cobblestone path, Robert retrieved an official-looking envelope emblazoned with the gold seal of the Sunny Pines HOA, an organization he'd fought tooth and nail to avoid when it formed a decade ago. His property had been grandfathered in as exempt, a fact documented in 3 separate legal agreements. Inside was a letter printed on expensive letterhead, signed with a flourish by Karen Wilkins, HOA president and former real estate developer. Robert's hands began to shake as he read. Per Resolution 47B, the association has completed boundary reassessment of all properties. Records indicate the rear 0.27 acres of your lot, including current unauthorized structures, constitute designated common area. You have 30 days to remove all personal items and structures before the association reclaims the space for community use. Robert nearly choked on his coffee. That common area contained his climate-controlled greenhouse, his grandfather's restored garden shed, and vegetables that had won blue ribbons at the county fair for 7 consecutive years. Within minutes, he was in his study, pulling out property surveys, deeds, and the explicit HOA exemption papers he'd insisted on a decade earlier. The legal language was crystal clear. The land was unquestionably his. When he called Karen, her syrupy sweet voice hardened the moment she realized who was calling. "Oh, Robert," she sighed dramatically. "Those papers are from the previous administration. Our updated community mapping uses the latest GIS technology. I'm afraid your collection of papers is simply outdated. Compliance is mandatory, Mr. Thompson. The neighborhood is evolving, and we all must adapt." The call ended with an ominous click, leaving Robert staring at the framed photo of him and his late wife on the day they'd bought this house, their forever home, 15 years ago. "They picked the wrong engineer to mess with, Ellie," he whispered to her image. James didn't just send a cease and desist letter. He arrived at Robert's house the next morning with a court reporter and professional surveyor in tow. "This is personal now," he growled, eyeing the destruction. Karen pulled this same stunt in Oakwood Estates before she moved here. They settled out of court with a gag order. But legal proceedings would take months, and Robert knew Karen wouldn't wait. For 3 straight nights, he worked in his workshop like a man possessed, fueled by black coffee and righteous indignation, drawing on his 40 years, designing electrical systems for power stations, nuclear facilities, and, in his classified days, military installations. Robert created what he affectionately called the deterrent. First came the foundation, a technically perfect property boundary marked with steel posts sunk 3 feet into concrete footings, removable if he lost in court, but sending a clear message. Next, he installed a sophisticated 3-tiered defense system. Tier 1. Motion-activated irrigation, using high-pressure sprinklers capable of detecting and targeting movement with surprising accuracy, perfectly legal and ostensibly for garden maintenance. Tier 2. An electrified wire system calibrated to deliver a shock that, while harmless, would feel like grabbing a hornet's nest, fully compliant with agricultural fencing regulations, as it matched exactly the specifications for livestock containment. Robert posted the required warning signs every 6 feet. Tier 3. A comprehensive surveillance system using military-grade night vision cameras concealed in birdhouses, garden gnomes, and artificial rocks, each recording to both cloud storage and a secured server in his workshop. The piece de resistance. Every component was solar-powered with battery backup, controlled by a custom app on Robert's phone, and triggered by a sophisticated motion analysis algorithm that could distinguish between animals, falling branches, and human intruders. By dawn of the fourth day, Robert stood admiring his handiwork when his phone alerted him to movement at the property line. Through bleary eyes, he watched his surveillance feed as Karen, Bill, and the landscaping foreman approached his newly erected boundary markers, bolt cutters in hand. "The old man thinks some posts will stop us," Bill laughed, reaching for the nearest steel pole. Robert tapped his phone screen gently. Instantly, targeted sprinklers activated, drenching the trio with unexpected precision. Karen shrieked as her designer suit absorbed water like a sponge. Bill, undeterred, lunged toward the fence line and grabbed the electrified wire. What happened next would become neighborhood legend. Bill's hair literally stood on end as he danced backward, howling not from pain, but from shock and indignity. The landscaper, showing more sense than his employers, was already retreating toward his truck. "You're insane, Thompson," Karen screamed, mascara streaming down her face. "This is assault. We're calling the police." Robert calmly stepped onto his porch, holding his phone up to show he was recording. "Please do. Officer Ramirez should see this footage of you trespassing again and attempting to vandalize my legally installed agricultural fencing, all of which is on my property, as the surveyor confirmed yesterday." Neighbors began emerging from their homes, drawn by the commotion. Mrs. Abernathy, who had lived in Sunny Pines since before Karen arrived, was recording everything on her iPad. Mr. Gupta from 3 doors down approached with his teenage sons, casually positioning themselves beside Robert in silent support. By afternoon, Robert's phone was buzzing constantly with text messages and calls from neighbors. The Hendersons sent over a homemade pie. The Rodriguez family brought beer and offered to help replant his garden. Even Mrs. Calloway, the 82-year-old former librarian who rarely left her house, hobbled over with a batch of lemonade and whispered, "Karen tried to claim my rose garden was on common property last year. I paid her landscaping fee because I was scared. Good for you for fighting back." That evening, a community email thread began circulating about an emergency HOA meeting to address recent concerns. In less than 24 hours, Robert had transformed from neighborhood eccentric to folk hero. Robert arrived at the monthly HOA meeting armed with a 3-ring binder of meticulously organized documentation. The community room of the Sunny Pines clubhouse buzzed with whispered conversations that abruptly ceased when he entered. He noticed how Karen and her cadre of board members, mostly new residents from the luxury extension of the subdivision, exchanged knowing glances. "We'll allow Mr. Thompson 2 minutes for his concerns," Karen announced when they reached the open forum portion, deliberately checking her Rolex. Robert had barely opened his binder when the timer on Karen's phone chimed loudly. "I've barely started," Robert protested, holding up a certified property survey. "The board has already voted on Resolution 47B. Karen interrupted, her crimson fingernails drumming on the table. "We've allocated funds for the new community garden and meditation space. It's a done deal, Robert. Progress waits for no one." 3 neighbors approached him afterward, whispering their support but fearful of crossing Karen, who had a reputation for selectively enforcing HOA violations against her critics. 2 days later, Robert was returning from his weekly Veterans Lunch Club when he spotted a gleaming Mercedes SUV parked in his driveway. In his backyard stood Karen, her husband Bill, the HOA treasurer, and a man in an expensive suit measuring his garden with laser equipment. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Robert demanded, his voice carrying across the yard. Karen didn't even flinch. "Just finalizing measurements for the landscaping team. Your non-compliance period ends in 18 days. "This is trespassing," Robert said, pulling out his phone to take pictures. Bill stepped forward, his cologne arriving before he did. "Actually, you're the one interfering with official HOA business. That's a $200 fine, according to Bylaw 15C, and Karen doesn't appreciate being photographed without consent. That'll be another violation." Robert called his old Navy buddy James, now a retired attorney, who promised to send a cease and desist letter. But before it could even be delivered, disaster struck. Returning from his doctor's appointment, Robert found his garden gate swinging open. Inside, 3 men in sunshine landscaping uniforms were ripping out his heirloom tomato plants and loading his greenhouse equipment into a truck. "Stop! What are you doing?" he shouted, rushing toward them. "HOA orders, man," shrugged the foreman, handing Robert a work order with Karen's signature. "We're clearing this area for the new community space." When Robert tried to physically block them, the foreman threatened to call the police. Instead, Robert called them himself. Officer Ramirez arrived 20 minutes later, by which time half of Robert's garden had been destroyed. Karen arrived moments later in her Mercedes, waving a document with official-looking stamps. "This easement clearly shows this land belongs to the community," she told the officer sweetly. Officer Ramirez, young and clearly uncomfortable, examined the papers. "Sir, this looks like a civil dispute. I'd recommend consulting with an attorney." After everyone left, Robert stood in the wreckage of his garden, holding the mangled remains of his grandfather's tomato plants. In the dirt lay a small brass plaque that had been uprooted, "Ellie's Garden in Loving Memory." That night, as rain pattered against the windows of his workshop, Robert sat surrounded by 30 years' worth of electrical engineering supplies. His fingers traced over the spines of technical manuals until they stopped on one: Advanced Security Systems, Perimeter Protection for Sensitive Locations. Beside it sat another: Agricultural Applications, Modern Electric Fencing. Lightning flashed outside as Robert pulled both books from the shelf, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Game on, Karen," he whispered. A certified letter arrived the next morning from Westbrook, Simmons and Patel, attorneys at law, demanding Robert remove his dangerous and illegal booby traps within 24 hours or face legal consequences, including but not limited to financial penalties of $1,000 per day and potential criminal charges. It was printed on heavy cream stationery with a gold letterhead that matched Karen's HOA seal. Robert wasn't intimidated. James had already filed for an emergency injunction to prevent further destruction of his property, but the real bombshell dropped that afternoon when Robert's doorbell rang. "Mr. Thompson, I'm Alessa Chen from Channel 7 Investigates." A young reporter stood on his porch with a cameraman. "We received an anonymous tip about HOA overreach in Sunny Pines. Do you have a moment to talk about electric fences and property disputes?" Robert's interview was measured and factual, showing documentation and surveillance footage rather than making accusations. The Channel 7 van had barely left when his phone exploded with notifications. His security cameras captured Karen and Bill having a heated argument in their driveway, gesturing wildly toward his house. The next day's headline read, "HOCK NDAWE. Retired Engineer ELECTRIIES Defense Against HOA Land Grab." The online version included his surveillance video of Bill's electric dance, which quickly went viral. #Don'tMessWithEngineers started trending locally. Suddenly, Robert's phone rang with a call from an unfamiliar number. "Mr. Thompson? This is Michael Westbrook." The voice belonged to the attorney who had sent the threatening letter. "I'm calling to inform you that our firm is no longer representing the Sunny Pines HOA in this matter." "Why's that?" Robert asked. "Let's just say my partners and I reviewed the documentation more thoroughly, including survey reports and historical boundary markers. Also, it appears my client may have misrepresented certain facts when retaining our services." That night's emergency HOA meeting was standing room only, held in the community center to accommodate the crowd. Karen and Bill were conspicuously absent. Ward member Jennifer Okafor, a corporate compliance officer by day, called the meeting to order. "In light of concerning information, the board has initiated a formal audit of HOA activities over the past 18 months, she announced. Preliminary findings indicate significant irregularities. A forensic accountant presented evidence that Karen and Bill had diverted HOA funds to a shell company called Sunshine Development, LLC, the same name as the landscaping company that destroyed Robert's garden. They had purchased adjacent woodland with plans to expand the subdivision, but needed access through Robert's property. When he refused to sell 3 years earlier, they began plotting to take it through HOA manipulation. "We found a draft marketing brochure on the HOA computer," Jennifer revealed, displaying a glossy mock-up showing luxury condos where Robert's house currently stood, with a community garden providing a view corridor to the new development. The meeting erupted in outrage. Board members who had rubber-stamped Karen's initiatives without reading the fine print looked physically ill. The vote to remove Karen and Bill was unanimous. Both resigned before they could be formally ousted, with Bill hurriedly accepting a job opportunity in Arizona. 2 weeks later, Robert answered his door to find Jennifer and 5 other neighbors standing there with gardening tools and flats of heirloom tomato seedlings. "We can't undo what happened," Jennifer said, "but we can help rebuild." Throughout spring, neighbors took turns helping restore Robert's garden. The HOA, now led by Jennifer and a diverse committee, including Robert himself, established transparent processes, clear boundary documentation, and ironclad protection for grandfathered properties like his. Karen and Bill's house sat empty for months before selling well below market value. The new owners, a young couple with twins, became fast friends with Robert, who taught their children about gardening and basic electrical circuits. The following summer, as Robert hosted the inaugural Sunny Pines Garden Festival in his backyard, Jennifer presented him with a custom plaque, "Thompson's Line, where engineering meets principle." His electric fence remained, permanently switched off but meticulously maintained, a silent sentinel and neighborhood conversation piece. Occasionally, when giving tours to new residents, Robert would demonstrate the sprinkler system, always to uproarious laughter. As for the surveillance equipment, Robert kept that operational, but repurposed it to monitor the neighborhood wildlife for a citizen science project. Ironically, the area where Karen had planned to build her development was instead designated as a community nature preserve, named in honor of Robert's late wife, Elise Woodland.